Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming in this apparently very busy afternoon to our conversation aimed to celebrate and discuss this wonderful new book, Our Palestine Question. My name is Orit Bashkin. I'm a professor of Middle Eastern History at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, Modern Middle Eastern History. We're happy to welcome today here Geoff Levin, who's a scholar of intellectual history, diplomatic history, American studies, Israeli studies, Jewish studies, Middle Eastern studies, Palestinian studies, and actually his work kind of thinks in very interesting ways about how these field of inquiries constituted themselves and what are the relationship between Israeli studies, American studies, Palestinian studies, and so forth. So he holds a PhD from NYU in Hebrew and Judaic Studies and History, an MA from Johns Hopkins, and a BA from Michigan State University. So what we'll do today is I'll introduce the book in a few words, and then we'll have a conversation kind of going back and forth about the book. So just as a way of introduction, I was thinking about a scene from a 1987 film by Woody Allen called Radio Days. And I saw it in 1988 or 1989 before we knew all this other stuff about. So just to make sure. So there's a scene in Radio Days where there are like these three Jewish kids, including the protagonist, who need money to buy the ring of the masked Avenger, who's a superhero that they admire. So they decide to steal the money that they collect in the blue boxes of the Jewish National Fund. And they're delighted that the donations are enough not only for the ring of the Masked Avengers, but also for an ice cream soda. So one kid asks the protagonist, should we leave some for Palestine? To which the protagonists say, why? Isn't Palestine all the way up in Egypt? So in 1987, the question that the Jewish director and the protagonist was asking was as relevant as it was for the film protagonist in the 1940s, and it is still very, very relevant in 2025. So our Palestine question asks questions about the relevance, the critique, and sort of Jewish Zionist reciprocity relationship in very interesting way. The book raises crucial questions regarding the relationship and the ideas and that American Jews had about Israel and Palestine. And in doing so, it challenges a very presentist narrative, which always ponders when rather than why or if or how. So when American Jews become Zionists. And then it's sort of a series of sub-questions that this narrative produces. Why did they become Zionists in the late 19th century? Do they become Zionists in 1948 or 1967? And the idea is sort of a teleology that leads to American Jewish support of Zionism in the 1990s and beyond. And I would say that this narrative is also echoed in Palestinian narratives about sort of the widespread Zionist influence in the United States from time immemorial. This book, however, brings to the fore other temporalities, other timelines, or other historical choices. So in the 1950s, shortly after the Holocaust, the book unpacks moment of support for the Palestinian citizens of Israel and thinking about aid to Palestinian refugees. In this book, 1967 is not only the year when American Jewish support for Israel crystallizes in many ways, and then we have other phenomena like the particular role of the ADL or even Kahana, but it actually look at 1967 as the beginning of engagements resistance, with the New Left, with the PLO. So it's a book that masterfully moves between biographies of fascinating individuals, and we'll talk about them in a second, and more institutional history of the United States and its Jewish organization. So I highly recommend that you read it, and you all have copies, so that's great. So my first question to you, and I have a series of questions. We'll go back and forth and then we'll open it up. And of course, these questions are always difficult because on the one hand, you want to solicit information about the book, but on the other hand, you also want to think sort of through more theoretical questions. So let's start. So the first question that I wanted to ask you is about the archives that you worked in. So you work in Israeli archives, you worked in American archives, you had access to private papers, to press collections, to booklets about Israel-Palestine. You went to PLO sources, you went to CIA operations. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit, since we also have graduate students in the audience, how do you decide on which archive you want to explore? And how do you read sometimes against the grain of this archives? Like you work on Israeli archives about political figures, but obviously you had a very different take on them. The same is true for American archives. So can you talk to us a little bit about the research that led you to this book?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Orit, for that overview and for doing this. And I thank you, Ken and Mike, and thank you all for coming. Yeah, that's a fascinating question. So, archives, when you have a historical book like this, the archives really make the book. And archives really shaped my interest in the direction in which it went. So I had started my doctoral program really interested in U.S. Middle East relations, U.S. Israel relations, and from a diplomatic perspective. But I was in New York, where there aren't diplomatic archives, but down the street from NYU, there's the Center for Jewish History, which houses YIVO, the American Jewish Historical Society, and several other archives. So I had been doing some graduate course work my first year, and I needed to write a paper that drew from archival sources. So the class had been on Arab, Palestinian, Arab Israelis with Professor Hillel Cohen, who taught a course on that at NYU 1 year. And so I was interested in the topics, and I went and looked at the Center for Jewish History's archives, and I found, actually, despite the fact that we might think American Jews weren't dealing with these questions before 67, I found actually very, very easily that there was. Like, this wasn't like it took an insane amount of digging. It was like, okay, no one has either looked at this or no one has found it something that they want to look at. So really that's sort of what got me into it, having this source base around the corner of American Jewish institutional records, that of the American Jewish Committee, American Jewish Congress, et cetera. And from there, I was interested in working transnationally and seeing, what role the Israeli government played in that. And so I had gone to Israel. These days, the Israel State Archives are no longer physically accessible. At the time they were, and now it's all digitized. And I could look at the archives of these individual diplomatic files and look at up the names of these American Jewish organizations that, and of course the Israeli state government had boxes of all these organizations, and finding how they're interacting, how they're trying to shape the narratives and shape the agendas of these American Jewish groups. And from there, it was really kind of just following the different stories. Okay, this mentions someone named Don Peretz. Maybe I'll reach out to him and go and just really, my method was always just to go and take as many photos or skim as fast as I can before coming to any sort of conclusion and going so quite quickly. In terms of reading against the grain, something that I found in a way more challenging than that is accounting for missing pieces. So I have this book it says 1948 to 1978, but it's very 50s heavy. So the book's shaped in part by the fact that Israel has declassified, and actually, it's supposed to have 70s material declassified, but it's made available material from the 50s, but not nearly as evenly in the 1970s. So to a certain extent, it reflects both what's available and the limitations of these things. So.
Okay, so I was wondering, and I have now two sets of questions that relate to how do you think about Jewish and American public opinion in relation to your book and sort of issues of reception. So this book presents, and this has been noted by several critics, very compelling biographies of Jewish thinkers and intellectuals and activists. So you have the Middle Eastern scholar Don Peretz, you have the Yiddish writer William Zuckerman, you have Rabbi Elmer Berger, you have Jewish feminists and reform rabbis, and other radicals and organizers and so forth. So first, can you tell us a little bit about these characters? What made you select these individuals rather than others? And then a related question is how representative are these characters? So you present to us a character like Don Peretz, who's sort of ingrained in Middle Eastern studies. But we can think about somebody like Leon Uris, who writes a book like Exodus that kind of shapes ideas about Israel amongst American Jews. You write about the radicals on the left, but I can think about the radicals on the right, like Ben Hecht, for example, and his relationship with Irgun. So what made you sort of choose these particular characters? And how do you deal with issues of reception or sort of hegemonic power in the field or importance? So again, I'm asking you to tell us a little bit about your characters, but then kind of think with us about why you chose them and do they represent something? Is the issue of representation important?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll break this into two parts. One is like why I thought they were interesting, how I got to these individuals. The first 5 chapters really focus on one or two people, and then the last chapter is post 67, so it really broadens out. And the other part of the question is why this is important and what it tells us. So again, I hadn't heard of these 5 people before I started this project. These are not well-known individuals. But going into the archive, looking at the history of American Jewish engagement with the Palestinian rights in Israel and the refugees, writing this paper my first year, I came across this name, Don Peretz. He had been the first one to write any scholarly work on the Palestinian refugee issue, on the Arab citizens of Israel. And I'd found his name in the American Jewish Committee records. I found his name in the Israel State Archives. I found that Israeli diplomats were pretty unhappy with him. So someone had pointed out to me that he was still alive. So I didn't know much about this person. I reached out to him. He was in his 90s. Someone connects me with him directly. I talk to him. He passes away. I visit his widow and end up doing some of my most important archival work on the floor of this retirement community in Maryland. And so who is Don Peretz? I found out not only is he someone who was a scholar, but he also had this fascinating life story. And so the first chapter of my book is all about Don Peretz, not only his work, but also who he was. So he's born in 1922 to a father who's a Sephardic Jerusalemite, a Zionist, who flees the Ottoman Empire during World War I, becomes a Zionist in America, marries an Ashkenazi Jewish woman. Don is born in 1922. He gets very interested, grows up in Queens. He's very interested in pacifism. He serves in World War II as a non-combatant in Okinawa. He comes back and is very interested in Judah Magnus and Martin Buber, this idea of a binationalist solution to the problems in Palestine, Mandate Palestine. So I didn't know you could do this, but he used his GI Bill benefits to study at Hebrew University, where these sort of peace-minded intellectuals were based. There, he actually falls in love with Zionism. His father had been a Zionist. He was never that into it. He was interested. Felt connected to the region. His grandparents were there. His aunts and uncles were there. And so what I found in his widow's home were these letters back to his parents from the 40s and onward, and that someone had kept. And I found this vivid picture of a young man in his 20s who falls in love with Zionism, and then a year later, when the war breaks out, is disgusted by the ways in which many Jews in Jerusalem are, very anti-Arab, and he's very opposed to the idea of this war. So he ends up becoming the first American Jew to help displaced Palestinians for the Quaker American Friends Service Committee the next year after the war. He gets his PhD at Columbia and focuses on this Palestinian refugee issue. He gets hired by the American Jewish Committee, and maybe I'll talk about that later. The Israelis get him fired. But I have this whole chapter that's basically his story. The next chapter is on a Yiddish-speaking journalist who maybe I'll talk about later, who also Israeli intervention. Another anti-Zionist rabbi, Elmer Berger, is in another chapter. This elite figure, James Marshall, whose father founded the American Jewish Committee, who was very interested in the rights, pushing for the rights of Arabs in Israel, and so forth. So I'm happy to go into more detail about any of them, but the point, and the last chapter deals with sort of the later generations of American Jews who founded this pro-peace group, Brera, which supported two-state solution in the 70s. And again, it's about many people, but it's in a way a collective biography of these American Jews who went to Israel in the 60s and 70s for a summer or for a semester and became convinced that Palestinian self-determination was in Israel's interest. And so why is it necessary? Like, obviously, to me, these were very interesting. I had great sources. I was able to paint this vivid picture. One is because these people, and to the extent there are sources on them, they're often entirely mischaracterized. They're painted as Jews who are disconnected, who are assimilated, who have no connection to the region, when actually they got involved in the question of Palestinian rights because they had exposure to the region, and going over there is what brought them to advocate in the ways they did, and so that felt very necessary. And finally, I'm telling the story not of people who are at the center of Jewish politics, but are on the margins. And so, what do you learn about the margins from studying something from its margins, from those who aren't allowed in or are pushed out? Like, you learn much about the bigger picture when you're looking at the critics, when you're looking at those who are at the edges of a political.
But when you think about someone like Zuckerman, for
Yeah,
example, I was very surprised to read about the American Bundists, which
yeah.
I always associate with like Eastern Europe. So do you think he's a product of like, let's say, older generations, like people like Emma Goldman and others that are kind of born American communists, or you think that he's kind of a creation of 1950s Cold War? Because you do talk about his interwar career. So like, how do you contextualize them within like American Jewish radicalism?
Yeah, so again, first chapter is parrots, second chapter is someone from a different generation, someone who was born in 1885 near Bialystok, migrates at age 15 to Chicago. This guy named William Zuckerman has a very, I think, very typical Ashkenazi American story, moving from the region where many did and to the places that many did at the times when many did. Becomes a paperboy for the Forwards in Chicago, ultimately becomes a journalist, based based Yiddish journalist based in London for a few decades for the American Jewish press, where he, becomes friends over the years with people like Emma Goldman, with the Mazauer family. If anyone knows Mark Mazauer, he wrote a book on his grandfather and his stories, very much in that milieu. Someone who had been associated with Boone but was never a member, had friends who were communist, anarchists, but was never a member, and so came through that. So in 1948, he moves back during the war. He moves to New York. By this time, he's a man in the 60s. And he decides to stop writing Yiddish. He starts something called the Jewish Newsletter. The Jewish Newsletter is a weekly or bi-weekly publication that runs from 48 to his death in 61. And what's remarkable about it is it's the only American Jewish publication that is consistently dealing from 48 until its end with the questions like the Palestinian refugee issue, like sensitive questions about Israel's policies towards Jewish immigrants, toward Arabs in the state, toward what he views as extreme nationalism. And if you look at his editorials or advisory board, which is just a list of people who, I guess, supported it, and they didn't necessarily write, it contains people from the labor movement. And so he doesn't view himself as someone who's necessarily associated with this, but views himself as someone who's of liberal inclination, that thinks that there needs to be an independent voice that pushes back. And so in that way, this becomes like a bit of a club for all these people with different, sometimes radical political views, even though he doesn't associate necessarily with any of them. And so I tell his story for better or worse, in part as the story in context of the Israeli government and the American Jewish establishment. His newspaper had originally been welcomed, and even in like the Hillels, and right afterward, he'd been republished in the major American Jewish newspapers in 48, 49, 50, 51. And then because I have the Israeli archives, they sort of show that like, okay, why aren't Zionists pushing back against this guy? He's a problem. And so in a way, I deal with him in this transnational way because that's what I'm doing. But he is, again, this in and of himself, this figure that's worthy of more analysis. And so I dealt with him in a certain way here. Marjorie Feld, who has a related book, deals with him a bit more. But in a way, he's this outlier, and he can tell you only so much about American Jewish politics, but the ways in which people are interacting with him and using this as a platform to touch on these issues, I think tells a much bigger story.
Yeah. So relatedly to the individuals, let's move now to the institutions that you explore. So how do you kind of think about influence or hegemonic and marginal positions in Jewish American sort of organizational life? So you had this book presents like a very, very interesting analysis of the American Council for Judaism. But it also presents more fringe organizations like the American Friends for the Middle East or Brera. So again, can you tell us a little bit about the organizations that you study, but also how do you think about them in relationship to other organizations, and the power dynamics between them? I think that there is a really interesting argument that you make about the tensions between Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Judaism and how they map out to the more radical organizations that seem to be connected to the Reform movement. And finally relating to these organizations, like when you worked, were you also thinking about kind of the shadow of the real and imagined power of AIPAC? Were you thinking about these organizations in relation to this? So yeah, if you can tell us a little bit about the organizations, the relationship, and again, the sort of how do we think about this, thinking about, the organizations that we see today.
Yeah. So, this is in a way, I didn't never pitched it this way, but it's like the world before AIPAC. AIPAC becomes a big factor in the 70s. It's founded in the 50s. For a while, it's just a one-man show. It's not a major sort of thing. So the Jewish political world I'm looking at in the 50s, let's say the Zionist groups, the explicitly Zionist groups, let's say they're right over here. They're fractured. They're sometimes associated with different movements. Some of them are calling themselves less political. There's Hadassah, which views itself as apolitical, it's Zionist. And they're over here. Then there's what I call the mainstream Jewish groups like B'nai B'rith, the ADL, and groups that don't call themselves Zionist. This is important in the 1950s. They're sympathetic toward Israel. I show sort of how they're beginning to view defending Israel as part of their agenda. That's not something that is immediately after 48, something that Jewish groups feel that they need to do. If you're a Jewish defense organization in the 1940s, your major priority would be, protecting American Jews, perhaps. At a certain point, defending Israel becomes part of the purview of these mainstream Jewish groups. And these Jewish groups become affiliated with Zionism in a more formal way. At the sort of edge of mainstream and not mainstream is the sort of this American Jewish Committee. The American Jewish Committee is explicit in this period, is explicitly non-Zionist. And it's important for that reason, but it's also important because at this time, it is arguably the most influential American Jewish group in Washington. So again, this is before big organized grassroots lobbying for Israel. These are this is a group founded in 1906 by sort of Central European Jewish reform elites in New York, and they have connections to the powers that be, the White House, and again they're posing themselves as non-Zionist. So why? They don't view the reform movement, going back to the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885, doesn't view Judaism as a nationality. It's very clear that it views Judaism, Jewish identity, to be a religion. And there's concern both for religious reasons and because of anti-Semitism that the idea of framing Jewishness as a nationality will lead to dual loyalty accusations, as well as just not fitting in with the worldview of these people who view themselves as American first and foremost. So it's very disorienting for these groups when 1948, when they view themselves as representing the Jews, and then suddenly there's a Jewish state. So how does that fit for the Zionist groups, which we're used to feeling like in a certain way that they're even with the Zionists in Palestine? And how does it fit for groups like the AJC, which are organized through fighting for the rights of minorities and refugees, which before 48, all Jews were minorities or refugees? So a big part of the story, and I can talk more about it, is that of the AJC and how it slowly steps away from non-Zionism, which it had viewed as being helpful to it in both advocating for Jews and even advocating for Israel. And then there's sort of the outside the mainstream, these groups, anti-Zionist groups like the American Council for Judaism, which is in a way an offshoot of the Reform anti-nationalism that isn't willing to sort of play nice and be moderate like the AJC, but really push against Zionism first and foremost for these anti-nationalist reasons, as well as smaller groups that come later like Brera, which is sort of pro two-state and which is a very radical position in the 70s.
Yeah. So, sort of thinking about this, I was wondering if you can tell us what your book says about the American context. Like, what does this book actually says about the U.S.? And I read there are two interesting anecdotes in the book that I thought were really interesting. One is when Don Parrott is at the American University in Beirut. It's actually the American Christian colleagues who want to kick him out. It's not the Arabs. The Arabs are fine, but they're like, well, you're Jewish here. Maybe it doesn't fit. So I thought that was kind of really interesting to think about, like American Christians in this context of like a transnational body in the Middle East. And there's another one of the sort of other sort of kind of mind-boggling stories in the book, and there are many like this, is about Kermit Roosevelt. So in Middle Eastern studies, this guy is known as kind of the Drek, the toppled Mossadegh. So like the guy who orchestrated the coup that led to the fall of sort of the Mossadegh, who was kind of a socialist and a progressive in Iran. And so this book, however, shows his engagement with anti-Zionist activities, with fostering his own kind of Jewish organizations. So, thinking about these two anecdotes again, what does your book say about the United States? What was the reception of these organizations by the American state? You have really interesting insights about sort of the Eisenhower administration in this context. So again, given the shift in American ideas about Judaism, Zionism, Arab nationalism, and how did you think about what the people and the organizations you're talking about in relationship to sort of post-Holocaust United States, the Cold War? How do they influence the relationship, again, between the American states, American bodies, and these organizations and people?
There's so much to unpack here.
Yeah, I know.
So like, I think one of the core questions you see, I think this is subtle, which is why it's great to talk about it, but who gets to determine what American foreign policy is? Who gets to determine what American interests are? So, coming out of World War II, before that, the people who ran American foreign policy is always the most elite field of American policymaking.
Yeah.
And so, used to 19th century, diplomats would buy their own places. They're wealthy people. But they were often, especially in the Middle East, people from the same sort of milieu, like very elite people come from elite backgrounds, Protestant backgrounds, a lot of overlap with oil interests, a lot of overlap with missionary groups. And a lot of the people running American foreign policy in the 1940s are people like Kermit Roosevelt, who is, blue blood. His grandfather was Theodore Roosevelt. And they felt, people of this Anglo-Saxon, well-off, boarding school background, felt that it was only them who could really determine what American foreign policy interests are, and really viewed Zionists and American Jews as people who were just dealing with their own sort of side projects and distraction, and really bad. And it wasn't just them, but they didn't view, I mean, they didn't view themselves as having any ethnicity, really. But they thought any sort of group that isn't unlike them is America. So I think what you see, I want to connect it. So that's why this Kermit Roosevelt is in the 1940s and 1950s organizing, using CIA funds, a group called American Friends for the Middle East that pushes back against Zionism in America and is bringing up the Palestinian rights organization issues and so forth. And that's sort of the background for why some of these groups, like the American Jewish Committee, need to deal with, are forced to confront Palestinian rights issues. So I think there's this idea. People think, okay, oh, American Jews, they feel morally troubled or upset about what's going on. This is something internal. And there are internal aspects, but there's always the context of other Americans.
Yeah.
And so in the 1940s and 50s, that context is white Christians. How do we do, and you see American Jews grappling with this issue, whether that's to push it aside, like some of the Zionists, to ignore the Palestinians because they don't want white Christians to pick it up, or to deal with it, like the AJC and these other groups, because they're afraid it's going to be used to foment anti-Semitism. Later, American foreign policy opens up. What it means to be American is changing. You know, you don't necessarily need to just be a American American. You can be an American who's African American or Jewish American or whatnot. And so American Jews are being much more integrated into the white American mainstreams through suburbanization, other forms of integration. Israel becomes much more popular more broadly because of Exodus than other, films and movies. And so the American Jews become part of the foreign policy establishment by the Johnson years.
Yeah.
And Israel becomes not this foreign place, but this place that Americans sympathize with. And after 67, the people who are bringing up Palestinian rights are no longer the white Christians, but they're the black radicals.
Yeah.
They're the secular new leftists. And suddenly American Jewish attempts to grapple with Palestinian rights, whether it's negatively to cover it up or diminish it or to deal with it, are done in the context of these other groups which are struggling for American foreign policy, something that American Jewish mainstream has been allowed into, but these groups are very much not,
Yeah. And, I was thinking about this because there's a line in Edward Said's Out of Place where he says, that he appreciated the Eisenhower administration. And I was always thinking, like, why would he write that? But now, after reading your book, I was like, yeah, that makes sense because they were, as you showed, the most cautious about sort of Zionism and Israel. So 2 final questions and then we'll open it up.
I want to get one more thing with that because it's not always in this book. I wrote another article in Arab Studies Journal about Arab students and the American Jewish establishment in the 50s. And, Arab students were brought to the, I told you about the CIA front group. Arab students were brought by this group in hopes of, courting in the Cold War context. And the forced Organization of Arab Students, National Arab American Student Group, is founded with CIA money. I mean, the people believe what they were doing. The students didn't know about that, but this is in the early 1950s. And I went through all these yearbooks and material from these groups, and these Arab American students had a very strong, positive association with America, and really associated with Eisenhower. This whole idea of there being an Arab American, rapprochement, and things start to change as things go on. Interestingly, I find the ADL and some these congressmen are talking about pushing them out once they start engaging in activism after the Suez Crisis.
Yeah, because I think that like in the Arab activism, there's always like 2 routes. So one is like we are always identified with like, the marginalized groups in the United States, the indigenous people, drawing comparisons to that. But you're right that like in the early 1950s, there was also like this idea that we're Christians. We have, there's the Holy Land language. There is a sort of, we also have a pioneering spirit and a capitalist spirit and things like that, that kind of trying to show we're the same.
Certain social conservative. Yeah. I mean, the biggest spokesman who one of your former students is looking at, is Fayez Sayegh.
Yeah.
Fayez Sayegh is the focus of one of the chapters, a Palestinian Christian Presbyterian, who's the major spokesman for Arabs in the 1950s. And he's making it, and his book is published by a conservative publishing house, and it's others of these anti-Zionist groups. So I find the 50s so fascinating because in a way it's so distant, whereas the 70s feel like much more, on the pathway today.
Yeah. Although we have it today, like I don't want to talk about it here too much, but like
Yeah.
people like Candace Owen and things like that who are like deeply conservative, but now are discovering like new anti-Zionist positions. And I think we can maybe think about this, like going back to.
Well, that's the fear of the AJC and these groups back then, is that the right wing, potentially anti-Semites or potentially will harp on the Palestine stuff.
Yeah.
So
let's two last questions. One is sort of thinking about the trans-regional and trans-imperial and transnationalist elements of your book. So I was wondering, if you see parallels across the world to this project. So, what about Europe or Latin America? Obviously, the Soviets are very different with their official anti-Zionist policies, sort of their own dealing with their anti-Semitism, they're changing relations towards that. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. But do you see, since we're talking about different society within kind of the Western front of the Cold War, do you see parallels to Europe or other spaces, or this is a sort of a very unique American story in your view?
I don't know if I'd say unique, but certainly during this period, the post-war period, America just has such an influence on world politics, and American Jews have more population and more influence in the United States than they do even in Britain or France, which are the next two countries that would come to mind. That being said, what might be some interesting parallels are the role of Jews during the Mandate era in shaping British policy toward that, where there's even more of a direct role. And American and British Jews are divided on these. There's some British Jews are opposed to the Balfour Declaration or really want it to be framed as because they're afraid of domestic anti-Semitism. And so that's, I think, definitely a connection. Whereas the post-war period, Britain is more a backseat in world politics, and certainly in Palestine. France as well, and I could see there is someone who's working on France and these issues in the post-war period. And I'm sure there's material on De Gaulle and what's going on there. But in the history of French Empire and dealing with Jews in North Africa and the work of that and how French Jews are trying to shape policy toward not Palestine, but these other places in which Jews and Muslims are interacting.
Yeah, I guess there's another book to be written about, what happens in France when you have Holocaust survivors, North African Jews, the Kharif that is very involved. And at the same time, you have kind of very strong commitment to the left by Jews in France, in England. Germany is obviously a different story. So again, just something to think about. And so we moved from like the characters to the organizations, to the American, to the global. And the last question is very temporal, right? So, and I think everybody who reads this book have this question, and you try to address it a bit in the towards the end of the book and the beginning. So, after October 7th, we saw many things. Part of it was like, very pro-Israel demonstrations, but also a lot of Jews who went and demonstrated for Palestinian causes, were part of the encampment. So and also people who are like, I don't care about this anymore within the Jewish community. So I wonder, like, sort of first, what made you write this book in the first place? Like you mentioned it a little bit when we talked about the archive, but what is the relevance of the story that you tell for today's world? And perhaps also, like, if you had to write something about like my book today, what would you write? Like if you had to write the last couple of lines like yesterday. So what is the relevance and how do you look at your book in sort of a moment of, I think, a deep and profound change uh, about the thinking of Israel within Jewish circles today in the United States.
It's a lot of great questions in that question. The book came out 7 weeks after October 7th. The final draft I submitted basically a year before. But I've had people ask me, of course, do you write it all after? And no, that's not how academic publishing works. I guess on me and writing it, I think I didn't set out to write this. This is mostly just the dissertation that was just made better, and the dissertation was finished in 2019 and was started in 2014, basically. And like I said before, I wasn't setting out to write this. I found sources that were really compelling to me, and I thought, oh, I could make something fascinating out of this that became cohesive. And so it wasn't something that I went into. It's not very thesis driven. It's very much connected to the archives and sources. That being said, like obviously this resonated to me in a certain way. I'm going through a PhD program, learning about some of these, Palestinian rights issues myself, and finding people 70 years ago who are also grappling with what they mean and what they mean in Jewish politics and what it means to be a Jew. And so when you're looking at these diary, they're not diary entries, but these letters from parents to his parents, or these oral history interviews of an activist in the 60s or 70s who's grappling with that, you can definitely see why it maybe resonated to me as something I wanted to be in a book, but also, the way it resonates to people today. The most important thing I've heard from anyone about the book was a student of mine who said, who read it after October, who said it made her feel less alone.
Wow.
Because it shows like a lot of, in the news, there's all these people with very strong opinions on this or that, but there's just I wouldn't call it a majority, but there's a lot of American Jews who are grappling with this, the fact that, oh, there is anti-Semitism, there is Jewish lack of safety, there are all these problems, but there's also deeply immoral, troubling things going on, in the context of Israel-Palestine on the Jewish side. And so, and so I think that sort of shows that there's a history to this, that people want to say, oh, people who are troubled by this or have any opinion left of center, that this is an aberration from the Jewish past. When I'm sure, no, maybe it wasn't the dominant opinion, but in every generation of Jews, American Jews who've gone over there have been Jews who've said, this is not a sustainable issue, or that there's ethical issues, or there needs to be something done differently. And so I think to a lot of people, I have the sort of sexy aspect is, oh, Israeli diplomats are saying this and that, and all these, but like, I think the most important is just showing the texture of these voices and what people are going, and this transformation of people over time, and showing, no, these aren't people who are just like radical individuals, but often people who are very connected to the region, and took their Judaism and Jewish identity seriously. Now, something that I didn't make, if I were to write things again and write afterward, I didn't put in the forefront the debate over Zionism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism being as sort of central to the book. And it really is, especially the chapter on Fayez Sayegh, because like everything, like every discourse, it's something that's constructed. You sort of see this argument from many mainstream Jewish organizations today. It's something that's, central to what the government is doing right now to students and activists and faculty and universities around the country, of the Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic. And I'm not even going to weigh in on whether that's true or false, but I show in the book that that's not always what American Jewish groups thought. And that American Jewish groups were grappling with this question of, and you can see very clearly that groups like the American Jewish Committee and even the ADL in the 1950s didn't have that opinion that they have now. So what does that mean? In a way, it forces you to de-essentialize some of these positions, and think more deeply about them, because we have these definitions that are based on temporal factors. And so I don't try and force opinions on anyone, but to show that something's been constructed under certain circumstances in certain times with certain agendas does sort of open up one's mind, which can lead to more critical thinking, and hopefully does.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and so with this insight that there were anti-Zionist Jews across history, let's again, and the much more profound insights that we've just heard, let's open the debate for questions and hear what you guys have to say.
Thank you. The division in Zionist thought goes way back to Herzl. And forgive my senior memory, but Herzl's secretary was a well-known rabbi who was friends with Martin Buber and Ahad Ha'am, and part of the group of Zionists who wanted the other type of Zionism, a Zionist state in which Palestinians and Jews live in peace and harmony, and forgive my sarcasm, kumbaya. My question to you is, and I think often historians like to look back and see lost opportunities. Did history ever provide a realistic opportunity for the type of living arrangement that these philosophers had in mind?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, sort of the direction of the Zionist movement and direction of sort of Palestinian opposition to Zionism were always sort of making any binationalist vision very challenging. There is someone who has come up in my teaching, a Palestinian who was interested in binationalism, a former Jerusalem City Council person, but just like Magnus, he didn't even really come public. It wasn't something that was, you know, resonated. These people were amongst their people around them from their communities were lightning rods. So I wouldn't necessarily say that this looked like it was something that was particularly viable, but wasn't something that people were pushing for in broad numbers. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of my research. I don't deal that much with pre-48 as much more about did American Jews find these, and diaspora Jews find these visions compelling? And you're even looking at Magnus, who's probably one of the best known. Judah Magnus is a Reform rabbi born in San Francisco, was very important in New York, had connections to the American Jewish Committee. He's an American Jew who's coming and becoming the president of Hebrew University. And so he's not even obviously most Zionists weren't born in Mandated Ottoman Palestine, but he's someone who's very, again, American coming in with this vision. So yeah, and Buber, these are ivory tower figures. So it's not really a mass movement for that.
Yeah. And then I'll pass it along. I'd like to hear more about James Marshall and the AJC. I mean, when I was coming up, I never thought I'd say this, but the AJC has proven to be fascinating. There's all kinds of great work being done on it. And I'm thinking a little bit, I guess my question is, can you situate for us a little more fully his thinking and their thinking about the Palestinian question and the Israel question in a range of other things that, if I think about Jim Leffler's work, that they were also really concerned about, and also Eric Oberle's work right after the war. I mean, they were really concerned. They took the resurgence of anti-Semitism very seriously. They funded, they were key funders of what became the authoritarian personality. And they were really lying awake at night worrying about this stuff. You can see this in Tony Michael's work. And at the same time, they were very interested in what was going on amongst Jews in the Arab world in North Africa. And I know that you mentioned in our conversation before that you're thinking now about a project that would explore American Jewish engagements with and thought about Mizrahi Jewish life and circumstances. So, and I think, the end of Jim Leffler's book about one of his guys, maybe it's Lauterpacht, who goes to Libya, he's in Tripoli, and he's trying to convince the Jewish folks there to think more carefully about where they want to throw in their lot with the national project. And they say, just get us the hell out of here and get us to Israel because we're going to be torn apart. Right? There's a sort of moment where the liberal visions of the AJC are under pressure from a lot of directions in the sort of 45 to or 43 to sort of 63 space. And so can you tell us more about how you see American Jewish liberal thinking about the Palestinian question in relation to a whole series of ways in which the national question for Jews and the Israel question for Jews become much more present and much more unavoidable? You can be anti whatever, but you have to kind of engage with them. You have to think about what your policy is going to be toward Jews who want to get to Israel. Think about your policy is going to be toward national claims of all sorts. And so I'm really curious to understand better. And you can even see this as sort of a commentary, right? So commentary goes from being the mouthpiece of the sort of intellectual connected to the liberal mainstream, right? And it wrestles with Israel in all sorts of ways, not just around the Palestinian question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a bigger worldview to these people, of this AJC crowd, or this. I would say the term that Nathan Kurz uses in his book on Jewish internationalism, that's these people are liberal integrationists. And I'd say after the 60s, they get superseded and they become maybe liberal Zionists. And now, that category is in its own, crisis right now. But this is before liberals. This is the AJC's worldview, and it's the worldview that's non-Zionism. It's not. They didn't have a big thinker. You don't have a book of. You don't have a bunch of book, but you see these are the guiding principles of organizations like the American Jewish Committee, and according to Nathan, in France and in Britain, they have their equivalents of that. They see the answer to the Jewish question. I mean, they eventually come to terms with Jewish statehood, but for them, it's not about Jews need to move to another country. It's Jews integrate into the societies they live in through liberalism, through democracy. And that's worked great for them. Again, these are elite Americans, but it's worked great for them in America. It's worked great for them elsewhere. So that's how it should work everywhere. And the problem, when there's problems, it's anti-Semitism, racism, they psychologize it in the post-war period and have their own different theories about what anti-Semitism is. But it does not mean that Jews have to move. It's not something that's sort of incurable, unaddressable. It's something that they can work toward mitigating. So, looking at the region, you talked about, it's the question, okay, does binationalism, is that viable? Jim Marshall. So Lewis Marshall is the most important head of the American Jewish Committee, most important American Jewish leader in 1910s and 1920s. He's a lawyer. His brother-in-law is Magnus. He's based in New York. He dies in 1929. But right before that, his eldest son, James Marshall, he sent him to Palestine to see what the potential is there, because there's debates about non-Zionists joining the Jewish Agency, which is big because the non-Zionist American Jews were the ones who had the money. So how can you get people who didn't like Zionism to contribute to aspects of the Zionist project? And so, James goes and writes a report, and ultimately Lewis signs on, and he dies in Switzerland right after the surgery. Anyway, when James Marshall goes to mandate Palestine, he says there's not an Arab problem here. There's a Jewish problem here. This is Jews are a small minority in the 1920s. Mandate Palestine. Well, it's unrealistic isn't binationalism. What's unrealistic is Jews taking over this whole territory. He doesn't foresee, of course, the mass migrations after big migration after Nazi Germany and so forth. So, and for him, the issue is for Jews in Palestine, like elsewhere, it's integrating into the host society and becoming part of that. And at best, for him and Magnus, they're becoming a binationalist group. That's because again, they don't foresee the history that's going to happen. Even in 1947, Jews are only a third of Mandate Palestine. So, and of course they don't support mass transfer of people being kicked out of their homes. So the events of course destabilize these ideas. I think after World War II, these ideas of international law, of human rights, these are projects that the American Jewish Committee is very much signed on to and supporting and shaping in certain ways. They're looking at the Jewish experience, the experience of minorities, and figuring out how to protect those. But as Nathan Kurtz shows, they're constantly sort of walking away from that because these solutions don't seem viable. You look at what the Jews in North Africa. In Libya, they're gone, very quickly. In Morocco and Tunisia, it's more questionable. But you have this great document from the AJC president in the 1950s, who had received some sort of word from the Tunisian Bey or something, but saying, if all the Jews leave Tunisia, it'll be like Hitler won, because Hitler wanted the world, thought that, so much of the world needed to be Jewish free. So facilitating the abandonment of diaspora communities, which is what these groups ultimately did, was against their ideology, which said that the Jewish problem is meant to be solved through integration. And so you had because of so many factors, you had the disintegration of Jews in the Arab world, but in a way that the Soviet Jewish issue really challenged the liberal integration assumptions, and I think paved the way for what became, liberal Zionism. But the Palestine question wasn't something that these groups could avoid. Again, until 1948, the mission of Jewish organizations, except for those focused on Zionism, was again protecting Jewish minorities, because every Jew was a minority. Jews were refugees, and suddenly you have a state, and you have a state that has its own minority, which it is not treating equally. It has its own refugees, which it's not dealing with well. How do you be consistent when you're arguing that Jews in Romania need to be treated in a certain way, because your enemies at the UN or your people you disagree with always point out, you're advocating for a state which isn't, being consistent with what you're trying to advocate for other minorities groups for. So there's constantly that challenge. And Nathan almost called his book Retreat from Humanity, because in a way there's a retreat from this sort of cosmopolitan liberal integrationist view toward various visions of Zionism ranging from liberal to right wing.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak. My name is Charlie. I'm a third year at the college. I guess my question is a little more theoretical. So you mentioned these groups, like right at the birth of the state of Israel, before and after, who are more worried about Jewish issues, specifically in America. They see themselves as American groups first. So given, I mean, you've alluded to this, so like given that the state of Israel has increasingly posited itself as like the global political institution for the Jews, capital of the Jews, do you think that political space of being like agnostic about Israel is still a space that exists for American Jews?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Well, I think talking about the term Zionism might be helpful to bring into this. So in this earlier period, it was never assumed that a Jew would be Zionist. Like there were groups that were explicitly Zionist, and that meant something. That meant that you believed in the Jews constituted nation. That meant you believed that maybe you're going to move over there, or you're affiliated with a specific political party. And so these groups, if they didn't explicitly associate with Zionism, they posited themselves as non-Zionist. Ultimately, throughout the 1950s and 60s, American culture is changing, American Jewish culture is changing. Zionism, Israel is through summer camps, through experiences, through the drama, culture, through the Six-Day War. Zionism and Israel become central to American Jewish life. And so, there's always anti-Zionist, but the assumption is that the main Jewish groups are Zionist or not, or Zionist or, unless others. I think there was a huge space on the political map throughout the Oslo era until maybe now or recently for this term liberal Zionist. There is a solution that meets the values of the bulk of American Jewry, because most American Jews vote Democrat. They're non-Orthodox. They believe in self-determination for peoples. They don't believe in human rights violations, and so that the two-state solution is something that liberal was central to American Jewish identity more than it has been relevant as an Israel political movement for some time now. Now you're at this point where that's falling apart. Obviously, you have a lot of Jews who are Zionists, some very Zionists, some who are supporting, who believe that every action of the state of Israel is essential and so forth, and that the federal government, what they're doing here is important. And you have Jews who define themselves in opposition to that, which, Jews who maybe aren't active in certain ways, who now are. But there's a lot of people who are in the middle and who were liberal Zionists and are now in a position where that position of a two-state solution, which seemed unlikely before October 7th, is extremely unpopular in Israel, is not something that looks viable from the Palestinian perspective. There no longer looks like there's going to be any international push for it. So where does this liberal Zionist center go? Or do they continue to be Zionist? Do they view themselves as non-Zionist? I think while maybe you can't be agnostic on any given issue, I think toward the ideology of Zionism and support for the state explicitly, I think that is a potential future direction of non-Zionism, of being a Jew who supports other Jews in Israel, who is pro-Israeli without being pro-state, or being agnostic of the idea of what the ultimate, outcome is, as long as Jews are safe in that region. Right now, there doesn't seem like any positive, no positive outcome seems particularly likely at that moment. But I think you'll increasingly see American Jews who are less ideologically committed, I think, to the idea of a Jewish state of being something of value in and of itself, because of what's manifesting in the region. But It's hard to say. But you look at the numbers of, especially of younger Jews, on some of these big issues. On, is Israel apartheid? Is Israel acting in a moral way? And these numbers are quite different than older generations. So I don't know exactly what that space is going to be, what labels it's going to use for itself, what's going to emerge after this terrible war ends. But something has to.
We have some questions from folks online, so let me just interpose one of those. Sheila Jellin asks, can you speak to how the contemporary discourse of diasporism fits specifically into American Jewish anti-Zionism historically and in the present?
Yeah, it's interesting. So something that's interests some people about the anti-Zionist from the earlier period is a lot of them are anti-nationalist. A lot of them view Jewish identity in a much narrower way than I think some anti-Zionists today might. The American Council for Judaism is the most outspoken, it's been the most outspoken anti-Zionist Jewish group, and it emerges in the Reform Jewish context, arguing that Judaism is a religious identity, and that basically that Jews differ from American Christians only because they go to the synagogue on Saturday, usually, instead of the church on Sunday. And again, these are in many ways quite, conservative. There's not these are people who are for Central European 19th century background, not sort of the great migration of most Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, which came in with Yiddish culture.
And Berger actually is incredibly racist toward East European Jews, as I recall.
I think a lot of Jews from that greater wave where most American Jews come from today, had a connection with Jewish identity that was something bigger than religion, that was involved Yiddish culture. And I think a lot of the diasporist movement today embraces certain aspects of that. I think actually Zuckerman, is someone who might resonate more with this diasporist vision, although he's not always as clear that he's an anti-Zionist at certain points. He doesn't quite use this term. And he's not a movement like the American Council for Judaism is. I think any sort of diasporist identity really presupposes that Judaism is broader than a religious identity, maybe even not primarily a Jewish identity. So that's something I think that differs quite a bit. I think there's some sort of fantasizing almost about this Yiddishist American past and it being anti-Zionist, when many Yiddishists, and probably most Yiddishists in the U.S. were Zionist. I think you have, because of what's going on in the Middle East, because of all the horrible situation, they're wanting to disaffiliate with war and death and everything. You have many American Jews who want to find a different cultural center for Jewish identity that's not Hebrew culture or Israel, and so that's natural for them to be looking to Yiddish culture and other past forms of Jewish political solidarity, like diasporism. And there are ways in which they can find that, but there's also certain challenges and some misremembering that can be helpful. But historians sometimes aren't the best ones to look for when you're on those matters.
Thank you so much for this great book. And I should say that I am sort of channeling some interlocutors because the Contemporary American Jewish Cultures Reading Group met earlier today to discuss your introduction.
Oh.
And one question that came up, mostly in a group of sort of graduate students who are working on religion, is the role of religion in this story and how you're thinking about American Jewish institutional life. And for me, this question came up most clearly in the chapter on Brera. I'm curious how, I have heard of the organization before, mostly as a kind of shift sort of away from the Chavurah movement, a sense that there was a need to engage politically around a specific issue, and then a kind of disenchantment when that political mobilization fizzled out and a sort of return to culture, a return to religious practice, a return to community. So I'm curious how you think about the religious pre-lives, after-lives, concurrent lives of some of these institutions, but also the figures who you trace throughout the book have, long careers, some of them in, or, ordination in the mainstream Jewish religious institution. So the broad question is, what's the role of religion in thinking about these specific institutions?
Yeah, so 2 weeks ago, I spoke at SUNY Binghamton, where Don Paris had been a professor, and I focused on him, and some people who knew him were there. Not a very religious person, a socialist, but I think for him and some of these other, the pre-Brera chapter first, it's like prophetic Judaism, certain ideals, and if some of them saw themselves as prophets in a certain way, pushing back, and so aspects of this resonate, and aspects of morality that Jewish morality that maybe overlapped with universalist ideas of morality resonated for them, and some of what they're doing, but it often wasn't something that they were talking about explicitly. Even Berger, who's a rabbi, wasn't talking about it often in that way, especially as time went on. In the 40s, some of his books did talk about that sort of thing. But I don't think it resonated for a lot of people I was talking with either. As much as the American Council for Judaism talked about Judaism as religion, a lot of the people were Reformed Jews who weren't particularly religious. But the Brera question, so Brera is called Brera, Project of Concern in Israel Diaspora Relations. It had two main missions. One is Israel-related stuff, and it ultimately goes in the Palestine direction, but the other is revitalizing American Jewish life. So there's this void. There's this, in the 50s and 60s, the younger generations are feeling like there's this emptiness, shallowness in sort of suburban synagogue life. And for earlier generations, Yiddish culture had existed, as the Holocaust, whatever, religion had its own way, but this question really opens up in the 50s and 60s. And for a lot of Jews, going to Israel and Zionism really helped fill whatever gap there was in their spiritual religious life. And you hear quotes, I don't know the exact quote, but Zionism, Israel become the religion of American Jews and so forth. And so that even was the case for some of these people in Beraa, but then they came back with some bigger issues with that and were more critical of it, which was created to some of the challenges. But there was a lot of other stuff going on in Beraa that I don't really write about so much. They're thinking carefully about gender and spirituality. And Arthur Waskow before he's a rabbi, is quite involved in these things. And so, but in a way it was sort of siloed. Like there were the people who were really interested in Israel-Palestine stuff. And some of them felt that they had to do these other things to get their credibility and be not only about Israel. And there are people who are generally interested in it. So, I mean, other figures came out of this group, Max Tickton, and well-known Hillel rabbi, John Ruske in Jewish life, Arthur Waskow, of course, who went in a lot of directions, but came out of this, you're familiar with it, Arthur Waskow, so, foreign policy stuff, and then he ends up being, rabbi interviewed him for the book. So there's not a lot of cohesiveness to it. There's one guy who's Orthodox background, Mezvinsky, who's an anti-Zionist. And, to a certain extent, that probably, I would say there's a lot more thoughtful connection now that people activists are doing now, like decades, just way deeper of trying to connect critical engagement with Zionism, anti-Zionism with religion than there was by really anyone in the period that I'm looking at.
That's a follow-up question. So about religion. So it's two. One is there any mentioning anxieties, critiques, desire to collaborate in the different organizations with evangelical Christianity or Christians organizations? So you're right about the Quakers as sort of pro-Palestinians in the context of Peretz and others, but what about other Christian movements? And then I love the fact that your book doesn't start in 1967, but there's obviously a shift to Messianic Judaism after 1967. So do they write about this specifically? Do they notice that with the settlement movement, Levinger and a lot of American Jews come there? So do they sense that there's something new in the air?
Yeah, I mean, I chapter 5 a little bit ties post 67. I mentioned Noam Chomsky, but most of the last 10 years is all in one chapter. I had the luxury in the first 20 years and the first 5 chapters in the book is I would focus on individuals, and it was such a small world and they all knew each other. And then after 67, there's such a bigger story, and parts of it have been told really well about the American Jewish establishment, the Christian groups. And I don't go into, even though that's happening at the same time, because I didn't have space, and I maybe allude to it at most a bit. But before the 70s, it's really the mainline Protestant groups, that are much more involved and interesting on these. It's really in the 70s that you have the evangelicals and fundamentalists and such becoming a big factor, in American life, especially toward the end of the 70s in political life, as well as on Israel issues, and AIPAC is going to. And the beginning of those stories is at the end of my stories, and I don't write about it so much. What's happening with the Christians during the 50s and 60s, again, these mainline people who had connections to the missionary movement, people who feel like that they need to do something ethically, like Dorothy Thompson is someone who's in these sorts of circles, even though she's not that religious herself. And, these American Jewish groups before 67 are very involved in ecumenical work, trying to do interfaith sort of things. And that's not really something with the evangelicals. That's something more with the Methodists and the Presbyterians and so forth. And the Quakers are very small, even though for us Middle Easternists, like other Quakers, they're a very small segment of American Christianity, unfortunately.
Thanks very much for this discussion. I want to ask you, maybe if you can reflect a little bit on your role as a historian. Orit asked you about the contemporary relevance of this work, and it's not such distant past that you're dealing with here. But how do you think about your role as a historian dealing with issues that many readers think about as of very contemporary political and ethical concern? You've sort of alluded to this a few times along the way, but maybe to step back and think about your work as a historian on a topic that is so fraught and so central to so much of the current political discourse.
Yeah. Well, as you can imagine, after October 7th and my book came out, I was very afraid to talk to anyone, to talk to my wife, or maybe book's out, I'll just go in my closet and, when I come out when the 10-year reviews come. But no, what ultimately I found is people want to talk about these things. People are afraid of talking about these things. And if we're talking not directly about the war, sometimes people ask about the wars we talk about, but we can talk about these core questions in the main issues by talking about the past, which is just much less heated. But it's also very necessary. Like how do you understand the Palestinian claims today if you don't understand what happened in 48 and how people are dealing with them? And in a way, this is a book that shows Jewish vulnerability as well as Palestinian victimhood, and so I think it's become a really helpful platform for lots of people, and oftentimes the conversations end up getting quite distant from the content themselves. I felt a sense of obligation too when I'm asked to do a talk. Sometimes there'll be groups that are more politically provocative, but who am I to deny people sharing this history? I'm the one who dug this stuff up, and it's sort of my job to get it out there. And I've actually been very pleased that I've had really an array of audiences that have found different things fascinating and important in the work. And yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, when you're a historian, you tend to be the one in the room who knows the most about the given topics, and that sort of gives you a certain ability to talk and be listened to. And I feel like that's there's a certain heaviness to that, but I try and get out there in the ways that people welcome. What is very hard is a time when things are just so terrible and heavy to like want to get yourself out there. Like, I don't want to push myself out into the world, but when people call, I tend to try and engage.
Thanks so much for coming. I guess one kind of narrative around the shift in the American Jewish community is this desire for integration through being like the American Christians and having beliefs that are not too different. So that was a motivation maybe for the kind of some anti-Zionist ideology. I guess some people might say that anti-Semitism also might come from being too similar or too alike to American Christians. There's a sociologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who writes about boundary identification and the idea that people in a multicultural society want some sense of feeling a little different. To what degree do you think that the embrace of American Zionism became a way of embracing a way of creating a boundary between American Jews and American Christians while also remaining similar to them?
Yeah, I think it became a very helpful in that role. I mean, fewer American Jews as the decades go on knew Yiddish or connections to Yiddish culture or to Europe. Fewer American Jews were engaged in regular religious observance. It's a lot, easier to go to Israel Day Parade than it was to keep kosher. Yeah, I think it's definitely spot on. I'm trying to think of what else you were asking. There's also from the other angle, like trying to figure out, I think Jews and American Jews in general are very hesitant to be lumped in with white American Christians, and there's this push for distinctiveness. And I think after '67, when Black American groups and other radical minority groups that started affiliating with the Palestinian cause, that's part of the reason it was very more painful than it should have been in practice. The fact that American Jews being told, you're not being considered as one of the minorities club. You're being considered just part of the white American mainstream, even though a lot of American Jews had been pushing so hard to become part of that white American mainstream. So there's some cognitive dissonance there. But in terms of, you asked sort of about the first period, I think that's relevant in a different way in the second period, because the break, it first happened, right after '67, the groups called SNCC, a civil rights group, which has been radical, the Black Panthers really came out for the Palestinian cause. There'd been a little before that, but whenever, now we're in a whole era where Palestine is the issue all the time. But a few years ago, the Women's March, whenever there's any sort of issue, it creates so much emotional anguish within the American Jewish community that outsizes its political purpose. That there's a lot, I think, to analyze in there.
If I can, you've been talking about the contemporary relevance of the book kind of post October 7th, but even just thinking about the last 2 weeks, let's say, like, is there a sense in which what we're seeing now, just with the kind of arrests, deportations, the way that kind of protection from anti-Semitism has become a cudgel of white supremacy, like, do you think of that as the kind of ultimate realization of the fears that some of the figures that, like, there's a kind of irony where in some sense we're seeing a realization of a fear that that these people articulated in the 50s, or is it, would you separate that, or is that too facile? Kind of, am I moving too fast with that?
No, there's so many sort of connections here. The question that came to mind for me, instantly, was the fact that I wrote the ADL in 1957, and a Republican congressman right afterward were saying these Arab student activists need to have their visas revoked because it's against foreign policy interests, American foreign policy interests, which is exactly what happened, last month. What's interesting is that in the 50s, they didn't say it's anti-Semitic. They didn't say we're protecting American Jews. The reason was, of course, because the ADL wanted to defend Israel and defend American Jews in certain ways, but that wasn't used as an excuse as it is today. In terms of your question, though, which is more of, I think the fear, you can see it in the American Jewish Committee papers back right after '48. They literally had a committee called the Impact of Israel and American Jews. They were fearing that this would come back and American Jews would be held accountable, and that it's for Israel's policies, and that it would, harm American Jewish life. I think you've seen that for Palestinian Americans and for American Jews. The fact that, a child got stabbed in Chicago, a Palestinian child, a year and a half ago, And I wrote an op-ed that never got published anywhere, saying that's the American Jewish fear, is that one of our children will get stabbed because of something in Israel-Palestine related by a crazy, and that's what unites us and the Arabs and Palestinians, is that there's this American Jewish fear for so long that this would ignite into something that is damaging for us here. And of course, there has been anti-Semitism and there have been people physically attacked here. But the Arabs and Palestinians, like we're seeing that even more so for those Americans and non-citizens who are living here. So, I felt that I teach on a college campus. I teach about American Jewish, Arab, Islamophobia, Israel, Palestine, and just trying to focus less on the region and more on sort of not letting that subsume life and people here was kind of what I felt like I and other people should have retreated to instantly, because that's what's happened. It's just it's damaging more and more people here in all these different ways. And I include in that the way in which American Jews have dealt with anti-Semitism and other forms of discomfort and whatever. And of course, even more so, the fact that the government is using this as a way to advance authoritarianism. It's more than I think any American Jew of the 1950s would have imagined. But I think we can see presidents for American Jews who would have supported that, even 70 years ago. So.